Hello and welcome back to Jubilee Revision. Today we're looking at crime and punishment, important dates for the history exam tomorrow, and this makes up half of it along with the Elizabethans as well, and this is just going to be the important dates in it, which is useful to use as evidence when you're trying to say something because it proves you know what you're on about. And I've split this into three sections: punishment in red, crime in purple, and law enforcement in blue. And this is a good idea because the questions in the exam are usually asked like, explain punishment in this specific time, or describe crime in a specific time. So you want to be able to separate these three things apart and show you know a lot about them, obviously. So let's start with the medieval era. So in 1352, it became treason for a woman to kill her husband. Treason's considered a lot worse than murder, and for murder you might be executed, but for treason you'd be burned alive. And yeah, it's a lot more severe. In 1361, JPs, Justices of the Peace, were introduced, and they heard crimes at quarter sessions 4 times a year. Quarter sessions slowly began to overtake manor courts, and manor courts would become less used over time after this was introduced. Okay, so next let's move on to the early modern period. So in 1531, the Jails Act was passed, allowing JPs to set up prisons to meet demand. And this included bridewells for vagrants. And vagrants were people who wouldn't work and would travel around the country begging and asking for money. And yeah, they would be thrown into these prisons known as bridewells at the time. In 1542, witchcraft became illegal, and this can be attributed a lot to the strong religious beliefs at the time. Of course, now we know that it's very unlikely that there was actual witches back in this time. It was mainly just superstition. Back then, they believed it seriously and had a lot of bad punishments for anyone caught being a witch. In 1572, the Vagrancy Act was passed, and that made vagrancy punishable by whipping. So if they caught someone as a vagrant, just sitting there doing nothing or asking for money, they would get them and they'd start whipping them as a punishment. So next, criminals began to be transported to colonies in America as an alternative to hanging. And this might not seem that extreme, but after being sent over to America, they would have no way of coming back, meaning that it was effective because they wouldn't be able to cause any more crime in the country anymore. And also, it was extreme because they would be forced to work extremely long hours and extremely hard work for like 7 years or something before they would be freed and allowed to live normally again. So they'd have a pretty miserable life over there. In 1720, Jonathan Wild, who was a famous thief catcher, worked with the Privy Council discussing methods to stop crime. A thief catcher was basically someone who was a criminal themselves and would turn in other criminals for a profit most of the time, and they were very prominent during this era. Basically, the fact that he was discussing something with the Privy Council shows that they were given a great amount of power and respect at this time, and corruption was there throughout the law enforcement. He got them to raise the reward for catching a thief, allowing himself to earn more money. So yeah, he tricked them into giving him more, basically. In 1723, the Wolf and Black Act was passed, and this made 200 petty crimes punishable by death. And an example of these crimes would be poaching, which was taking an animal from a lord's land and killing it and eating it or making it into something else. And yeah, this, you wouldn't think of something as that extreme. However, at the time it was happening a lot, so they decided they wanted to shut it down. So they thought, what's the best deterrent? The death penalty. And this was one act in a series of something called the Bloody Codes, which was a series of things that were made to make the death penalty used a lot more often. And yeah, its main cause was as a deterrent. In 1750, the Bow Street Runners were set up, And these were a group of people. They were set up by Henry Fielding, and they were an elite team of highly trained men who would catch criminals. And an important thing about these is that they were funded by victims, which means they didn't receive any money from the government or anything, which is sort of why they managed to get highly trained, because they would receive a premium from victims because there was nothing else around to help them. People would be willing to pay them a lot of money to do this work. In 1777, John Howard wrote The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, which is a book that called for prisoners to have running water, clean conditions, and individual cells. And the recommendations put in this book would be set up in the future, and these things would eventually happen because of the ideas that he had and the things that he said. And it's important to remember that after 1750 we have just gone into industrial Britain. So yeah, this is a time where there is a lot of poverty and stuff like that, so it's understandable that it would be in prisons. So let's continue in industrial Britain. So in 1780, transportation was now to Australia, as the United States had gained independence. So they'd only recently discovered Australia, and they decided, if we're going to start sending criminals here, because America doesn't want them anymore, because it has become its own country, it's not just one of our colonies. And yeah, Australia was even further away from America, so in a way it was a better place for transportation to occur. And if America's already a set-up country, you don't really want to send more people there, as they will have a much better time than if you're sending them to somewhere where there's basically nothing and forcing them to build something and make things out of nothing. So in 1785, Sir George Onesiphorus Paul, a high sheriff, rebuilt Gloucester Prison with individual cells, exercise facilities, class separation, medical care, and religious instruction. So he added all these things, some of which were suggested by John Howard, which would make it better for prisoners at this time. And in 1797, the Thames River Police were set up by John Heriot, and they would stop cargo being stolen and would become funded by the government in 1800. So because they were this successful at stopping things from being stolen, the government wanted to join in funding them, and this was quite a long time before the actual official police force, the Metropolitan Police Force, which we'll look at later. So I guess you could say this was sort of like a trial run of that. They found out it worked, so they were planning something for the future. So in 1813, Elizabeth Fry visited Newgate Prison and made recommendations for reform. She decided a lot of things would help, like women should be given work there so they can earn money, and education should be offered so they can learn things and get out of the poverty that was causing them to commit crime. In 1815, it was the end of the Napoleonic War. And this was important because it led to an increase in crime, as soldiers would come back from fighting and realise that they had transferable skills into the world of criminality. They didn't have any jobs either, which was terrible because there was a great increase in the population during this period. In 1820, the Bloody Code ended, which we know was there around with the Wolf and Black Act. It ended, so less crimes are punishable with the death penalty. And this can sort of be linked to the idea of reformation. A lot more people believed that people could be reformed in the industrial period, as we've seen by the many reformers before us today, such as Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. So, the Metropolitan Police Force was set up by Robert Peel, and it was fully funded by the government, but not effective at this time because they employed working class people and didn't pay them very much, so they didn't have much ambition to actually do their job well. And this happened in 1829, and that's a very important date that I would recommend you remember. In 1837, the pillory was abolished, as many people died in it. Because the point in a pillory was to humiliate someone. They'd be put up in front of the community and everyone could laugh at them and throw rotten fruit and that sort of stuff. But however, that people were put in them and then they might die because of the bad weather, and they were left in there for a long amount of time and couldn't get out. So they could catch things like hypothermia, and it could lead to their death, which was very harsh for the crimes it was given for, being mainly just offences against people in the community and mainly moral things. So in 1842, Edwin Chadwick published a report arguing that extreme poverty faced by the poor led to crime. So he was saying that, like, it's because these people live in bad conditions that they're ending up in crime. We shouldn't blame it on, like, their genes or on things like phrenology, like many people, well, still believed in this time. In 1856, the County and Borough Police Act made it compulsory for all towns and counties in England and Wales to set up a proper, full-time, paid police force, similar to the Metropolitan Police Force set up in London. So, just a few years, just less than 30 years after the Metropolitan Police, the government decided they want something like this everywhere because it was starting to work better, it was starting to work well, and people liked it. So next, in 1861/1862, we've got the garroting scandal, and this occurred making the public believe more serious crime was happening. So before this, they didn't see much crime being reported, but suddenly the newspaper and stuff starts talking about a garroting scandal. Everyone feels like there's much more crime and a lot more danger in the world around them, and that can make their views stronger towards punishments, and this is sort of what happened and led to the Prisons Act of 1865. The Prisons Act made prisons harsher. Criminals had to do worthless jobs, such as a crank or treadmill. They had to eat plain, repetitive food and sleep on solid boards. In 1868, public executions were ended, as they were often seen as entertaining by the public, not just a deterrent. And this isn't, of course, what the authorities want. They don't want the people turning into the sort of people who find this normal, someone getting killed in front of them. That may encourage them to do more violent things themselves. So next we've got 1896, and Broadmoor Hospital was set up. It was the first specialised prison for mentally ill criminals. So before this, they would just be put in a regular prison with everyone else, but now they'd actually be separated and treated differently based upon their needs, which would help them. In 1902, hard labour, such as the crank and treadmill, which were introduced in 1865, were stopped in prisons and weren't allowed anymore. In 1922, there was no more solitary confinement, so people couldn't be stuck on their own anymore. And this was a positive, as it could do a lot of bad things to people and make them feel a lot worse. And prisons overall got much better conditions because of this, because people were, not on their own, not stuck in a little cell. In 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights was made, and it protects people's rights, making more crimes recognised. So more bad things happening in the world would actually be considered crimes instead of just being considered okay because of this. In 1972, community service was introduced as a punishment, and this would be helpful to communities, as they would have people helping and fixing things and making things better, but also it was another way of reformation. If someone's going around helping people, that's generally going to make them a better person, and especially if they're a criminal, that's maybe what they need. In 1972, the Crown Court was introduced, and the public were called to act as a jury in this court through jury service. This was very different from what we had before, because we would have specific people chosen to be on the jury, but now it could just be anyone. And that would be a lot better, because it would represent the views of the country a lot better. In 1984, DNA was discovered, and this was used to discover the identity of both victims and perpetrators, because they always do a DNA test when someone comes in, like if say a dead body comes in, they'll do a DNA test to find out who it is, but also they'll do a DNA test on the surroundings of the crime scene, on the weapons and stuff like that, to find out who did it, who was the perpetrator. In 1988, young offenders institutions were set up to imprison child criminals, and this allowed them to be separated from older offenders who may influence them. So this would help them turn away from a complete life of crime, because they wouldn't be surrounded by people who would encourage them to become better criminals, essentially. So in 1989, the death penalty was abolished for all crimes, and this again is due to a heavy belief in reformation, but also it's because a lot of people were wrongfully given the death penalty, and after that happens, they can't go back again, that sort of thing. And yeah, that was crime and punishment, important dates. I may have said here that punishment is in red and crime is in purple. I actually got it the wrong way round, so wait. No, I didn't. I just thought I did because one or two things were in the wrong colour, but it should be alright. So yeah, these are actually alright. Punishment is red, crime is purple, law enforcement is blue. Some things just confuse me, like the bloody code ending. Less crimes would be punished with a death penalty. I would probably consider that punishment now, instead of would I've put it as crime, but that one was obviously just a mistake. So yeah, thank you and goodbye. This has been Crime and Punishment, Important Dates, and I hope you try your best to remember some of these for your exam, as they make a good piece of evidence and show you have a lot of knowledge on the topic. Thank you and goodbye.